Before we get into the video, I need you guys to do me a favour. Number 1, like the video. Also comment, let me know your thoughts on the story. Davey Glover, better known as David Glover, has managed to rebrand himself as a public speaker. However, the Newcastle gangster and enforcer was a big problem for the streets of Newcastle, especially Ellswick and Newcastle's West End. Having spent a mammoth 30 years in the prison system, in over 40 different prisons, including Birmingham's Wilson Green, the Underworld hardman was considered erratic, crazy, and a bit of a loose cannon. He was a person you did not want to mess with, and quite frankly, he was responsible why Paddy Conroy was given the reputation he was given. Now, David Glover grew up in a famous noble street, fully immersed in crime from a childhood. Now, David Glover is probably most famous for being convicted for the brutal and chilling gangland torture of rival gangster Billy Collier, along with Paddy Conroy, whom he had known since childhood, roughly 9 years old, as Paddy has been in a relationship with David Glover's mum's sister. Now, concerning the incident with Billy Collier, both men denied doing it. However, David was a problem from a young age. His first crime came at the age of 9 years old, when he had robbed a local paperboy at Blade Point. For that incident, David Glover was put into secure care. Because David Glover kept escaping, he was considered such a high risk. He was eventually put into a social unit. At the time, David Glover was put in a facility where the worst kinds of teens who had been convicted of M's, were housed. By the time David Glover was 16 years old, he was fully an accomplished robber and enforcer, and had been in jail for putting hands and feet on a police officer after David had been roaming the street while being a wanted man. Now, David Glover had been carrying a sawn off and fired at rivals' houses after they had scrapped after a few beers. Now, this specific rival was said to be 30 years old, and the two men had scrapped 3 times. At the time of his arrest, David Glover was being driven by his brother in a Mini when a police car approached and actually cut them off. David Glover opened the car door and exited the Mini while it was travelling at 30 miles per hour. Now, David, being a heavy-set man, ran as fast as he could, and he managed to run round the block to Noble Street Flats and pulled on the entrance door, yanking it close behind him. And the police officer followed, knowing that Davey was a wanted man. So, holding the flat door entrance shut, the police officer had attempted to open the door. At the time, Davey and the police officer were playing tug-of-war. Now, because David Glover is a madman, he had a thought, and that thought was to do the officer in. So, Davey let go of the entrance door. The police officer fell forward into the entrance of the flat, and then David took the police officer's radio and began to smash and crack, target area being the face. Ultimately, David was arrested, and he was jailed for 6 years, while it was 7 years in the detention centre, but it got reduced to 6, which he described as a fun time, because it was all he knew. Now, David Glover was such a polarising character that it was said in 1991 David Glover's friend, criminal Cookie, who had established himself as a robber as well and stealing cars, had been in a pub in Newcastle's West End and had seen a notorious Newcastle madman starting a scrap with his dad. Now, Cookie and the madman had brawled with each other, and it ended up spilling on the streets. Cookie was chased with machetes. Now, with tensions high between Cookie and the Newcastle madman, David Glover had just come out of jail, and he went to visit Cookie, hearing rumours that Cookie was good at stealing cars. So David Glover then told Cookie that he would sort the madman out. Now, according to Cookie, David Glover was the only person crazy enough to scrap with the madman 3 times, and from there was no issues. Despite the fact that Paddy Conroy took on the role of uncle to David Glover, David was not fond of Paddy, and still isn't. The two men had 2 different sets of morals. Paddy made himself look better by scrapping people with no names, and even small-time gangsters that were just trying to feed their family. If a robber or a car thief or a small-time dealer had a little bit of money in their pockets, Paddy Conroy would sniff it out, and he would use any excuse to extort you, even if you were from Newcastle's West End too, the same area. Now, Paddy Conroy was able to get away with this because the Conroy name had a fierce reputation, which was established from the 60s and 70s along Scotchwood Road and Newcastle in general, and Paddy Conroy attached himself to David Glover and his gang. Paddy was never known to be a scrapper. it was said that his younger brother Michael Conroy was the one who had a big reputation, and the Conroy family was known to control the drug trade and even taking on police. Now, on the day of the Billy Collier incident, 1995, Davey Glover was working as a gangster for the notorious Conroy family. Now, Davey had set off to visit his dad, who was Newcastle's legend, of course called Big Davey, due to his heavy stature, as I said. So, Davey Glover was travelling to Durham to see his dad in Durham jail, when Paddy and his associates arrived at Davey's mother-in-law's home. Now, Paddy Conroy's dad's headstone had been tampered with, and Paddy was said to be out looking for retribution. At the time, there was a gangland feud, and that was against the Conroy family and crime families such as the Harrisons. During this situation, it was tense and things had escalated. For example, Paddy Conroy's home had been fired upon. Now, Paddy Conroy and David Glover had driven down Alswick Road, where they saw Billy Collier by the shops. He was quickly snatched up off the streets and put in the Range Rover. The men then drove Billy to a flat in Alswick. A 2x4 piece of wood and a gas canister was used against Billy's legs. Billy was said to have writhed in pain and screamed until his voice went hoarse. Billy, who was also folded up at the time, was put in a chair and then strapped down. Now, according to David Glover, Paddy was not in the room. However, an associate had taken out a pair of pliers and yanked Billy's teeth out, tried to clip his nostrils, and then clipped Billy's ear. Red had dripped all over the living room. Now, according to the rumours, Billy Collier was screaming for at least 30 minutes. After the chilling ordeal, David Glover left the flat and continued on with his day by visiting his dad in Durham prison. Shockingly, some Newcastle gangsters turned their back on David Glover. After it emerged, while being in Birmingham's Wilson Green's prison, David Glover had written a note detailing the incident. In that note, David Glover says that he acted as backup for Paddy Conroy. Now, David Glover at the time was having a breakdown, and at the time he did not sign the note and insisted he did not give any statement to the police, so therefore he could not be a grass. However, the police and the prosecution used the note as evidence to help secure both Paddy Conroy and David Glover's sentence. Paddy Conroy was ultimately jailed for 11.5 years after he had been caught in Spain and then transferred back. As for David Glover, he was jailed for 10.5 years. Again, both men denied that they committed this crime when concerning Billy Collier. Now that David Glover is a free man and trying to change his life around for his 4 children, hopefully he can do his best. But from just his demeanour, you can tell that the drinking culture and the drug culture has played a massive part into David Glover's personality and his demeanour. From the shakes and also the slurred speech, it's had a lasting effect. Still to this day, he's probably a guy you'd never want to get on the wrong side of. Stay safe.